Well, today we're in downtown Aurelia at Couchiching Beach Park. This is one of my favorite places to come with my family. Oftentimes that we come down here, actually most often that we come down here, I run into people that I know that are, battling addiction or facing homelessness. And you might even see these faces as you walk down on the walking trails down here, come out to the park. Sometimes need is obvious, right? Sometimes we see it and we know it, and other times it's a little more subtle. During our Love the City week, we would minister in neighborhoods that were, seemingly affluent or maybe even middle class. And on the exterior, you wouldn't necessarily see what the inward realities of the impoverished circumstances that some families were living with, or just the implications of mental health on families and children. And so sometimes need is obvious and other times it's not. In our parable that we're looking at, observation isn't necessarily just the main point, but it's a necessary piece in the dialogue going forward and being able to respond. So Jesus tells this parable to the teacher of the law after they have this dialogue back and forth where Jesus then questions him and he reels to justify himself. And Jesus is now going to set himself up for his final question to the lawyer by telling this parable. And now the site for the parable is this really treacherous journey from Jericho to Jerusalem. It was this 17-mile journey that was known for its dangers, and this is the context for which this parable takes shape. Luke 10, verse 30. Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now, by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion." So the site for this parable is one of danger, this dangerous road. And we see that based on what we've just read, that this man was captured and beaten by robbers, stripped of his clothes, and even left for dead. I guess the equivalent would be maybe even hard to imagine in Aurelia, but maybe downtown side alleys, walking down those places at night. This was the equivalent for the road. The story presents opportunity for mercy for these key religious figures that would make sense to become the heroes of the story. But we see them both walk by on the other side. They don't respond and turn towards and help the man in need. Instead, they pass by on the other side. And you can just imagine being that man lying there, half dead, and maybe just partially being able to recognize these figures and thinking, yes, these people are going to come and rescue and save me. They're going to help me. We aren't given any insight into the motives of these religious men, but we see that they are blatantly ignoring the need. Some people speculate that that they're coming back from religious duties and then they'd be unclean and would have to go back to the temple. And so there's different speculation as to what it is. But the one thing that we do see and the one thing that we know is that they don't respond in love. They don't respond in need when it's right in front of them. Instead, they pass by on the other side. Now, I think for us, if we're really honest with ourselves, in the same way that we can identify with the lawyer in our self-justification, I think we can also identify with the priest and Levite in knowing and seeing needs all around us, but being the people who step aside and move out the way. I think there's a couple different issues for us in our cultural context. The first, I think, is that we can become so busy that we feel like we don't even have time to respond when we actually see need. We have so much going on in our lives that we might even justify to ourselves, well, I'm doing all of these good things, and when there's real need that we're presented with in front of us, we turn from it because of how busy our lives are. I think another problem that we have in our society, and this is especially heightened in COVID, is that we can exist without meaningful engagement in the lives of those who are around us to even be aware of the needs that exist. We can be so distanced. We can keep to ourselves, isolate so extensively that we can be distanced in every way from the real needs that are represented in our communities. And I believe this is something we need to fight back against as a culture. This is a problem that existed even pre-pandemic. I remember Dave took us to a conference years ago looking at just the the brokenness of neighborhoods and how we in the West, increasingly individualistic West, we build bigger fences for our own privacy. We have garages that we can drive right into and exist within our little communities without even knowing our neighbors, without having any relationship with them. The ideas of like borrowing some salt or sugar for baking or cooking, they're just like foreign concepts to us now, where we would not engage in the lives of our neighbors, where we'd be sharing resources and caring for one another, even knowing family dynamics. And there's this distance from like neighborhoods existing as relational centers. Part of that is, the rise of the automobile, where we now commute to work, we commute to church, we drive to our grocery stores, and there's not that same sense of like tight-knit community. But I think that we need to fight back against this, that there are people around us with great need. And with these distancing measures and with this isolation and the individualism of the West, we can exist without meaningfully engage in the lives of our neighbors. So the first thing that we need to do is to be aware and to make ourselves available and to stand against these kind of cultural rhythms or realities that exist, so that we can be conduits of change in our neighborhoods, so that we can be creating margin in our lives to actually know our neighbors, to understand what the needs are, so that we can actually position ourselves to respond. Because otherwise we can just be like ostriches, with our heads in the sand, ignorant to the needs around us. But we do know. That's just living a lie, because we do know that there's great need in our community. And if it's not physical need, if it's not emotional need, if it's not mental need, it's certainly spiritual need. We know that our neighborhoods are not full with everyone who knows the gospel. And you and I, we might be the closest connection that our neighbors have to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And yet we can somehow exist comfortably in the confines of our home without finding ways and being creative and engaging those who are spiritually lost. This is not just positioning ourselves to engage and respond to physical needs. It's a holistic approach as believers, that we care for the physical, mental, social, and spiritual needs that are represented in our neighborhoods, in our workplaces, in our schools. And this is something we've been talking about from the very beginning as a church, that we are to be ambassadors of the gospel in our context where God has us. The story takes an interesting shift here, and this is what we're going to look at next week, where all of a sudden the Samaritan comes. In verse 33, "But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion." Something as modern-day readers of this text we might miss is just the shocking implications of the guy who's going to become the hero of the story, is this lowly Samaritan. This one who would have been the non-neighbor becomes the one who's exemplified as a true neighbor. And so there's a shock factor here. We see that the Samaritan, he observes, he sees, he acknowledges that there is a need, and compassion compels him to respond. The compassion moves him to not pass by on the other side, but to engage. It starts with his awareness and being able to see it and to know it, to feel it deeply, and that compassion compels him to move. And we know, coming out of our discussion last week, that this kind of a response and this kind of feeling and burden for these needs is something that comes from knowing and understanding the grace and love of God in our lives. If we're going to be actually burdened for the spiritual needs of those around us, then we need this heightened awareness of the life we have in Jesus and the need that others have for the gospel of grace. But if we're living without a recognition of that need, then it's going to be obvious why we don't respond with urgency to these things. Without the love of Jesus compelling and shaping our hearts, compassion will become limited to humanitarian or a reduced version of what God would have intended for us as His people. And so this week, I just want us to take time to ask, what are the needs represented in the lives of those around me? Am I even aware of what the needs are in this community? Am I aware of what the needs are in my workplace, in my neighborhood? Am I even in a position to be able to respond, or am I so isolated and withdrawn that I don't even have a pulse on any of these things? And if that's the case, maybe we need to think about what are ways that we can create margin? What are ways that we can start becoming intentional to become aware of these things so that we can position ourselves to respond and go and do likewise as Jesus commands? Next week, we're going to look at details of that response, but this week I want us to just focus on looking around, observing what are the needs, and then what is God going to call us to do.